All right, are we ready? This is the hard time to stay awake, right? That's the advantage of speaking. Hard to go to sleep when you're speaking, right? Well, thank you for being here this afternoon. I think there's still some downstairs. I enjoy seeing you all interact and visiting, and it's good to connect with others who are going through the same type of thing you all are. Each of you is going through. So let's start with this afternoon session, and I don't know how long we'll go. I'll get through with my slides well before 3 o'clock. In fact, maybe even by 2 o'clock. And I hope to have some time for questions and discussion, and you all can determine if you're tired and ready to go home or want to keep talking about some of this. A lot of what I'm going to talk about this afternoon, my voice is getting weak, I can tell, but a lot of what I'm going to talk about this afternoon will build on things that we talked about this morning. And I mentioned this morning that words that hurt greatly are the words "get over this" or "you will get over this." And those are hard words to hear. They're undesirable. You don't want to hear those words because you interpret those words to mean, I will forget that this happened. And you don't want to forget that this happened. You don't ever want to forget the person that you lost. Me mentioning the name Garrett to everybody is a way for Garrett to live on. The fact that I'm standing here talking about Garrett in front of others is important to you all, isn't it? Yeah, Garrett will continue to live in a lot of different ways and continue to have influence and so on. And we could talk about, I could go across the room and talk about this person and that person and this person and that person. And so getting over it is not something we want to do. However, we do want it to get easier. We want it to get better. We want it to get where we are not as consumed in a difficult and burdened way as we are early on. And so instead of talking about whether or not we're better, whether or not we're getting over it, how long is this going to take? To me, it becomes a matter of moments of joy. Moments of joy. And let me go ahead and click to this next slide. So Deborah lost her 30-year-old son. She's the one that I told you about at the first part this morning. Probably the first official grief counseling client that I had. Some of you might happen to remember when Wayne died. Wayne was driving home from work one day. He was coming through Summertown, almost to Highway 43. He apparently had a seizure, even though on this side of heaven no one will know. But he, for some reason, apparently passed out, had a seizure, ran off the road, through a chain link fence, and hit a Tenneco natural gas pipeline that came up out of the ground. And when he hit those pipes, they exploded, and the car exploded, and there was nothing left. Very similar to the type of imagery that several of you all have from October the 10th. And so we began working with Deborah sometime about between a year and 3 months, if I have to guess. I have tried to go back and find it. I can't. But she sent me a text one day that said what you see on screen. She said, it's still blue. The sky is still blue. I hadn't seen it since Wayne died. I had forgotten that the sky is blue. And I think there's several reasons for that. I think one of them was she finally was to the place where she could hold her head up. She finally got to the place where she was able to enjoy things again. I brought Deborah a few months ago to one of the Grief Share support groups that we had, and I asked her, will you come meet with us? Because the group had members all very in the early stages of grieving, and they were at that place where they felt like, I'll never be able to be happy again. And I asked Deborah in front of them, are you happy most days of your life today? And she thought about it. She didn't know what I was going to ask. She thought about it, and she said, yeah, I am. And then she quickly said, I don't miss Wayne any less, but most days I'm happy. Well, that's what this journey transitions into. It transitions into, if you want to call it a new normal, I don't like that term, even though I'll use it some. But whatever term you use to describe the new life that you are without a person that you were sharing life with, life will never be the same. No way it can be. However, you can get to that place. Some of you won't be able to believe this, but I promise it's true. And some of you are already beginning to see it. You will get to that place where you spend way more time thinking about how blessed you were to have had them and what God did for you in giving you that person and the good times and the good memories, instead of spending most of your time thinking about the fact that you don't have them anymore. Now, you know what the difficulty of that is for me to say that? The difficulty for me even to say that is I realize that even though I say that, if it's so fresh and so new, it's almost impossible to accept. But I promise it'll happen. I've seen it over and over and over again. And that's the end goal. And besides, it all makes more sense when we couch it in what we talked about this morning. This world's not our home. We're just passing through. Really doesn't matter if it's 20 years or 60 years or 80 years or 92 years. It's that we make use of each day, right? And when we get on the other side, when it's unending, then that's what it's all about. Well, let's keep going. How you view this session will determine where you are in the process. If it's a few weeks, if it's a few days, if it's a few months, few years, it's not all unusual for us to have a Grief Share support group and we'll have somebody who lost a child or a spouse 8 or 10 years ago and they feel like they've not grieved as they should have and they want to go through the process. Everybody's different. I'll go ahead and do these. I refer to them. If you're in the early stages of grief, the thought of experiencing joy, you can't accept it. A few months down the road, most desire joy, but feel they will never have it again. However, early on, you have brief moments where you feel it. It just doesn't last very long. However, ultimately, these moments of despair become fewer and farther between, and the moments and eventually periods of joy do reappear as a normal part of life. And that's one of those conversations that we know is true, even if it's hard for you to believe it can happen. You can think about grandma or grandpa and how they eventually got to where they enjoyed life again, they did things, or someone that you know, yeah, it happens. And it'll happen for you too. And my desire is to give you hope as well as tools that will be helpful to you in your grief journey. When I grief counsel, I don't have anything that's rocket science. Several of you mentioned at lunch today, man, you described it exactly how we felt. Or the way you described it is exactly what happened. I wish I would have had you to tell me this stuff years ago, and others said similar things to that. The thing I do most that helps is give people hope that they'll be able to live and enjoy life again. And God helps us to do that. So what about this question? How long does it last? You want to know that, don't you? Yeah, how long does it last? Well, first of all, what's it? Are you ever going to not miss Garrett? No, of course not. You don't want to not miss Garrett. Of course not. One of the meanest things I could say to you is I guarantee you the day's going to come that you won't even think of him. Ooh, that'll never happen. We don't want it to happen. We want to remember. However, we also want to get to a place where we can function somewhat normally, whatever that means now, right? So how long before we get to there? Well, what does it mean? Will this ever be undone? Well, no. Losing somebody close, we are faced with a big reality that eventually, even though at first it seems like a shock, it seems unreal, we kind of wake up in the morning thinking surely that was a bad dream. But we eventually get to the point where we realize, no, this is a very real thing. The person I loved is not going to walk on the face of the earth again, so it's not going to be undone. What is grief? In the question of how long does it last, it's the outward appearance of what we feel inside. It's the outward appearance of what we feel inside. I told somebody this morning, I may have told you all, if we fight shedding tears and inside we feel like crying and we choose to hide it and not shed our tears, it doesn't make us feel any better. It doesn't change what's inside. It just changes what's on the outside. And sometimes it makes it worse. That's why I tell people, if you feel like crying, cry. If you feel like shedding tears, let it go. And I get it. There are times that I have to fight my emotions. Sometimes I can, sometimes I can't. Sometimes it gets in the way. Sometimes it makes people feel uncomfortable. But that's all right. Our feelings are our feelings. And the grieving process is really an ongoing process of emotional relief. All of us have heard the words, having a good cry. Have you ever seen... In fact, forget that question. Let me ask it this way. Have you ever had that ugly cry and then laughed at yourself for doing so? I have. I remember Tina's dad at the cemetery when his brother died. I remember Lieutenant Colonel walking across that cemetery, and suddenly he started crying in a way I'd never seen him cry before. He was out of control. And then when he got it over with, he started laughing at himself, primarily out of embarrassment. But you know what the end result of that was? He needed to let that go. He needed to get it out. And sometimes we just need to let that pressure go. How long does it last? I don't know. Everybody's different. However, over time, the more these things happen, the less they are needed. the more these things happen, the less they're needed. We will talk about triggers. But I'll go ahead and say something that I'll say later, and that is this. The more we experience a trigger, the less intense it becomes. Benjamin talked a while ago about the song that he heard the morning Adam died. And he listened to it last night for the first time. We all heard him say that and thought, ooh, that had to have been hard. If he listens to it again tonight, it will also be hard. If he listens to it again tomorrow night, it'll still be hard. If he keeps listening to it, it's going to keep being hard. But truthfully, the more often he listens to it, the less hard it will be. And that's part of the grieving process. How long does it last? Well, it has an awful lot to do with how often we are subjected to triggers. Has a lot to do with the circumstances. However, the process very much is that the more we deal with those hard things, the less intense they become. It's difficult to see, especially in the early stages, but it's very true. The concern comes for those who choose not to appropriately process and address those intense feelings. If we avoid and avoid and avoid and avoid, and I'm not saying don't avoid, especially in the early stages, there are things that you need to avoid. If you don't avoid, it's going to set you way back. But if you don't push through some things that are difficult, you won't make progress in your grieving process. I'll give you an example. I didn't plan to say this, but I think it'll work. There was a couple who now are friends of ours. In fact, they live in Fairbanks, Alaska. Week before last, they had their 12th child. That in and of itself should bring grief, right? 12 children. Several years ago, when they only had 8, they called me and they said, the husband has extreme PTSD. He was a medic in Iraq and Afghanistan. And he has crashed and burned months ago, and it has affected everything. Will you help us? And I said, you're in Fairbanks, I'm in Tennessee. And I said, I think this is going to involve a level of intensity that requires more than a computer screen. They said, we think you can help. And I had done a lot of PTSD counseling, but I didn't want to claim to be something I wasn't. And I told them, I said, look, I'll help if I can. And so finally, we decided that they would come for a weekend, and we'd spend the weekend working, and then they would decide what we did from there. So they came to Columbia, spent the weekend, just mom and dad, and they wound up coming to Columbia for 8 months, moved here for me to work with them. He was in a terrible place. His job was, after the United States Army had bombed facilities, to go in and determine casualties. Sometimes the facilities were Taliban and sometimes they were not. Sometimes they were family with small children. I've heard things in the counseling room people ought not to hear. People especially ought not to have to experience. And when he came to Columbia, he couldn't drive. He couldn't be around people. First thing he did when he got back was put a screen over the exhaust pipe of the family van to keep somebody from putting explosive devices in the exhaust pipe because of where he had been and what he had seen. It was intense. And so we progressively started moving him forward. He very faithful Christian, but he couldn't handle being in church, in worship with anybody anymore because there were too many people. He didn't know who they were and what they might be doing. And it all made sense because where he'd come from, he had to worry about everybody. He had a PTSD dog. I've had a lot of PTSD dogs in the counseling room. I remember the day we got him sitting in the driver's seat of the van. Man, breaking out in sweat. I remember the day we got him to the point of putting it in reverse and backing up and then driving backing forward. I remember the day we got him to go back to church at a 17-member congregation where he and the family went in 5 minutes after they started so they could sit on the back row and see everybody, and they left 5 minutes early. I remember the day we moved him to Kathy's Creek congregation that has about 100 members. I remember the day he drove himself to Walmart by himself with his dog. He actually went in and came out and drove home. Now you're saying, why am I telling you this? I told him, you're going to have to do things that are uncomfortable. Because if you don't, you're going to get stuck right where you are. If you try to take too big of a step, it's going to throw you backwards. And it's going to do more harm than good. It's going to think you'll never make it. But if you don't try to do some things that are uncomfortable, that are difficult, and you refuse to do that because it hurts, you're going to stay where you are. Does that make sense? And it's the same in the grieving process. If you try to do too much, it's going to throw you back. If you don't do anything, you're going to keep slapping on Band-Aids and you're not going to heal. You'll stay right where you are. Let family members encourage you and friends to do some things, but then you decide what you can handle and what you can't. You decide what you can handle and what you can't. And I will tell you, you're going to miss some of them. You're going to drive to the Gulf by yourself and get there and decide I shouldn't have done that and break the speed limit coming back home because it created too much anxiety. You're going to try to sit where you used to sit with him or her in church for the first time, and you may get up halfway through or early on running out crying like crazy saying, oh, that was a mistake. You're going to do some of those. Why? Because it's trial and error. Just remember that as you do these things, it's important to push yourself so that you don't get stuck. Does that make sense? And nobody else and how they did it gauges how fast you move, what you do, what you try, what you don't try. So instead of how long does it last, can I hope to again wake up in the morning and look forward to living the day? Absolutely. Absolutely. But there's some work to do to get there. So let's talk about the quick decisions. Rodney and I were talking about some of those at lunch. Quick fix decision. The pain is so severe. The person grieving looks for relief. These Band-Aids that we talked about this morning. And so if I've got a terrible, terrible headache, this is a weak illustration, but if I've got a headache that's killing me and I can take something and it'll give me a little bit of help with it, I'm probably going to take it. And in fact, I may take it. If it helps, I may take it again, and I may take it again. Why? My point is, when we are hurting so badly, we will do anything to get relief. Problem with that is, sometimes we make those mistakes trying to find that relief from that pain, and sometimes the mistakes we make are big enough that we need to back away from those big time decisions. Quick fix decisions, sometimes they involve sales or purchases. In fact, give an example. In fact, the relationships, the next one's not what I thought it was. But when my grandfather died, my dad's dad in Nashville, we came home from the funeral home, and you know what my grandmother did before she took her clothes off? She went and got his Bible, and she brought it to me, and she said, I want you to have Pappy's Bible. And I said, I was 22, I think. I said, Grandma, I don't think you need to be doing that right now. I don't think you want to be giving me his Bible. Well, she was all in fix-it mode. What do I do with this? And I told her, I said, we'll talk about it later. And I said, you keep it for now. The truth of the matter is, I don't know whatever happened to Pappy's Bible. I don't know who got it. I didn't, which is okay. I got the .22 rifle. That's what I wanted. But you know what happened? My grandmother, who read her Bible every day of her life, got to where pretty quickly, instead of reading out of her Bible, she read out of Pappy's Bible. And she felt close to him in doing that. But what had she given that to me? What if she had done that? She wouldn't have had the opportunity to do that. I'll give you another example. Some of you will start squirming a little bit when I talk about this, because you will have done this, but yet you don't want anybody to know. Somebody said to me earlier today, made the statement about going and cleaning out the closet and getting rid of the clothes soon after the funeral. Some people want to do that, and some people don't. Some people do that out of pressure from family members and friends and others. But you know what a lot of people do? Especially spouses, especially women. They take great pleasure in closing the bedroom door and going into that closet and burying their face in those clothes, because you know why? You can still smell them sometimes, can't you? Now, is anybody going to stand up and say, don't do that? I'm not. And if somebody gives in to the pressure of emptying that closet, they're taking away that opportunity down the road of being able to continue to enjoy that relationship. Now, for people who have never lost somebody, they may be hearing me say this and go, wow, that's strange. But for people who've been through it, it doesn't seem strange at all. And that's why we have to be careful with these decisions. Some decisions, if they're wrong, don't matter. But some decisions, if they're wrong, could matter significantly so. Trying to determine which is the challenge. We got a member at West 7th who, in fact, he's the one who streams all of our West 7th stuff, Calvin. Calvin would be okay with me telling, he told this recently in a grief share group, that after his wife died, after a few months, he decided it was time to clean out the closet. So he took her clothes, he folded them carefully, took him forever. He put them all in a big bag, and he gets to Goodwill. And when he gets to Goodwill and he starts to take them out of the car, out of the back of the SUV, he said, I can't do that. I'm not ready to do that. And he took them back home and put them back in the closet. I appreciate the fact that he tried. I appreciate the fact that when he got there, he realized he didn't have to do that. Anybody go tell him he messed up? I'm not going to. I don't think he did. I think he's trying to move forward, and he's figuring out the trial and error way that it works. So try some things. What constitute some of these quick fix decisions. Sales, get rid of the Bible, sell the house. You know, I've seen a lot of men, when she died, go out and buy new cars. Relationships. It is the case that women live better without men than men live without women. I can prove it. How many times have you ever heard a woman say, if something happens to him, I'm not doing this again? You ever heard women say that? Anybody in this room ever heard a man say that? I finally did one. I had one man to tell me that a few months ago, and I told him, I said, you've just killed what I have said for years and years. Now I'll have to say I had one man to say that. But relationships oftentimes are Band-Aids. Truthfully, I've done a lot of marriage counseling from two individuals old enough to remarry after they lost their first spouse each and tried to repair their loneliness by a new relationship when they weren't ready for it. Well, that's hard. Loneliness is a word I hear all the time. Major life changes, be careful about those. While these may temporarily mask the loss, and I'll say it the way I said it a while ago, if these decisions cannot be undone and they have significant influence on our lives, then be careful about not making them too soon. However, when you make mistakes, don't beat yourself up for trying. You're in survival mode. It is get through it. So what about the new life? I don't like the term new normal. I don't know why. I just don't. There's kind of nothing about the new life that feels normal. But often people use that. Once someone we love has died, our new normal is something completely different from anything we've known before. We are different than we were before. Our lives are different than they were before. Normal doesn't even seem like anything that's graspable anymore. It is a new life. It's a whole different way of going about things. Causes me to learn things that I've never had to know before. That creates stress and anxiety because everything falls now on me. However, there's also a feeling of satisfaction when we achieve things that we've never had to try before, or when we accomplish a task that have never had to be done before. And in the process, sometimes we make good decisions, and sometimes we make bad decisions. The new life redefines us. I go from being a wife to being a woman. Sometimes a parent to a woman, a husband, or a couple. From a parent of one number of children to a different number. Can't help but to think about Mark. Mark talks about when they go places and they are introduced, or they'll introduce themselves to someone and they will say, "Do you have children?" What do they do with that? They had Mary Helen, but she no longer lives on this earth. They choose to say, "Yes, we have Mary Helen. She was killed in an automobile accident, is now in heaven, but she's still our child." Yeah, it's a good answer, isn't it? The new life sometimes involves the son becoming the patriarch or the daughter becoming the matriarch. The new life involves going from a partner to co-counsel and decision maker, from having a constant sidekick to doing everything by myself, it feels like, even when others are around. But while no discipline for the time seems to be joyous but grievous, when we handle adversity right, it makes us stronger. Everyone who lives long enough has new chapters. While none will be as difficult as losing someone special in death, we can still, even emotional moments like today, understand that when we go through hard things and we go through them well, we come out of it stronger. And what's kind of funny, and I'll lighten the mood a little bit, is that a lot of these things that put us in despair earlier, we laugh at now or later. So Lisa was coming home from Mayfield, Kentucky, back to Columbia. She had been to see her sister. Her husband had died 4 or 5 months earlier. She was trying to figure it out. And God chose to bring her home that night, I think. She knew something was flashing on the dash, but she didn't ever worry about that because Carrie always took care of something that wasn't right. And so she called me the next morning and she said, I think something's wrong with the car. And I said, well, what is it doing? And she said, something is on the dash. And I said, take a picture of it and send it to me. Well, what it was the sensor in one of the tires was showing that she had a tire that was low. And when she showed me the picture, it showed me that that tire had 5 pounds of air pressure. 5 pounds of air pressure. You know what that means, don't you? It was flat. It was flatter than flat. But yet, she made it from Mayfield, Kentucky, and she said the light came on the dash not long after she left Mayfield. Well, if she were standing here with me today and I had my arm around her and I said, Lisa, you want to tell them about that moment? She'd start laughing. She'd go, oh, yeah, well, boy, did I sure learn? I can just see her saying that. But you know how she felt that morning when she was telling me that? Oh, I miss Carrie. Why do I have to do this kind of stuff by myself? But you know what? She and I went to Harbor Freight. We bought her an air compressor. I showed her how to use it. And today, if she has a low tire, she knows to put air in it and drive as fast as she can to the tire store. And you know what? When she learned how to put that air chuck in that air hose, she was proud of herself for doing it. And I heard her the other day when we were in one of our group support groups telling one of the other women what to do if she had a flat tire or a low tire. Now she laughs about those. They weren't funny at the time, but she kept pushing through it. That's what the new life does. She also let the propane tank get completely empty in January before calling the gas service to come. And of course, it was 10 degrees outside. They told her they couldn't be there for a couple of days. She had to improvise. If I asked her today about it, you know what she'd do? She'd just start laughing. She figured it out. We figured it out. And it was okay, but at the time it felt overwhelming. What about the woman who told me, I didn't know you had to put oil in a car? Well, you learn sometimes about all you can do is laugh at it. Moving forward at your own pace, there is no standard. The pace is determined by too many different characteristics of the individual. How long is it going to take? I can't answer that. I was helping a woman several years ago whose husband had just retired. At age 65, they had their retirement plan to travel. A week after he retired, a week to the day, he got up, walked out of the bedroom, fell down in the hallway of the house on the way to the kitchen for their morning coffee. She heard him, she went to him, and he died of a heart attack in her arms. And I had a lady from West 7th who had lost her husband a few years prior and was very gracious and strong in figuring out her new life. And so I asked her if she would come and help me with this lady. And she made the statement you probably already have read, but boy, it is so true and filled with wisdom. The woman who had just lost her husband was crying so deeply and was asking, why is this getting harder? And she said, when my Dewey died, God placed a blanket of numbness on me, and he took it off a layer at a time as he knew I could handle it. Well, that's what happens. Most of you are here today because you've experienced or are experiencing the grieving process. You kind of remember the funeral home. You kind of remember the morning of. You kind of remember those first days, but you will say to me or others, it's just all a big fog. Some things I remember, some things I don't. And then at some point, if I had to guess, I would say 3 months down the road, they will say to me, why does it seem like it's getting worse? And the answer's here. Because the shock is wearing off. The reality of what happened has become increasingly real. You know, because for those first few weeks, you still go through the house, and when you hear somebody, you think it's them. You expect to see them drive up. You think you heard them, and then a split second later, you have to remind yourself that can't be. But after a period of time, you get to where you don't do that anymore because it is fully real and raw that they aren't there and they aren't coming back. There's a big hump there to get over and start making progress again in terms of how it feels. And I think she's exactly right. God helps provide what is needed to figure it out and deal with it. And it's not at all unusual for me to have to tell somebody at 3 months or 2 months or 4 months, yeah, I understand it's harder, but you will manage it better. At the beginning, there's not much thought of making progress. It's more a matter of surviving. However, soon pressure from others and ourselves causes us to begin to measure where we are compared to where we were. And in order to move forward in grief, one must handle some of that level of discomfort that I talked about earlier. These are all examples that I've mentioned. What do we do? What do we not do? And again, it is trial and error. Let me go back to this. I briefly mentioned this, but let me deal with this again, then we'll try to move on pretty quickly. If I'm grieving and I've had 5 good days, or maybe 2 weeks of I haven't cried, I've done pretty well. Hey, we had grandson's birthday party and enjoyed that, or wow, I actually was able to go places and do things. I think I'm making progress. All that's good and all that's great. The problem is it's not like you arrive there and you're not going to have any of the triggers or the issues again. And what happens is if I've had 2 good weeks and then one of those triggers blindsides me because I had 2 good weeks and I'm telling myself I'm doing better, then I have that trigger that takes me back down to ground zero or worse. My first thought is, I'm never going to get over this. I'm never going to be okay. And when they come into the counseling room, and in fact, I tell them on the front end, it's going to be a roller coaster ride. There are going to be days that slam you. Those are the days that I'm going to tell you, all right, you're not going to stay down. But when you have those good days, it makes the bad days seem worse. When you have the good days, it makes the bad days seem worse. So what do I do with that when it's somebody in the counseling room who's just having a bad day? First thing I tell them is, all right, you're not going to stay here. Wait it out. Manage it. Do whatever you have to do. Get through it. Second thing I tell them is, we're going to start gauging how often you have bad days, because you are starving to believe that you're making progress. You are starving to believe that you're making progress. And if I can show you, hey, you went 4 days, and sometimes I'll say, 2 months ago, you couldn't have gone 4 days for anything, could you? No, that's right. Progress. And if you'll start charting those mentally or however, those good days and how few and far between the bad days are, they'll keep coming, but you'll see that they're getting farther and farther apart. And instead of that slamming you, at least as it slams you, it can slam you less, because you will eventually get to the place where you go, man, I hate bad days, but I know I'm not going to stay here. That's a good place to get to. Noticing your growth is important. Well, what about time? Mark said the passage of time is a mixed blessing. In time, the people who were marginally aware of your loss will completely forget it. You will encounter more and more people who know nothing about your loss. You'll be faced with a decision about how to inform them. Sometimes you'll decide it's better to not tell them anything. At other times, you may decide this person should know the whole story. With time, you will learn how to tell one from the other. Now, I think Beth and I were talking earlier when she talked about, there's someone who was talking about that feeling of what it's like, right after the whole world supports you like never before. Man, you appreciate your community. You appreciate your church family. Everybody is bringing food, offering, wanting to help. But it doesn't take long at all before it feels like everybody else has gone back to their normal life, and they've left me on this island, or us on this island, all by ourselves, and we can never return back to normal. And it feels unfair. And sometimes it causes us to start blaming and feeling sorry for ourselves. That's just part of it. Usually part of that process is our remembering we used to be like that too. We'd show up at the funeral home and we'd make a call or two, but pretty soon it wears off and we hope they're okay. Some level of that is always the case. And tomorrow morning, I'll talk about how church families can help those who are grieving. And we'll talk about how we, as people who care for others, can help them and do a better job of this. Time does provide this resentment of everybody else gets to return. However, time also provides experience and practice in learning to manage the challenges. A lot of widows who have learned how to do an awful lot of things for themselves. There are a few men who've learned how to make their way around the kitchen that didn't know how to before. We learn how to make financial decisions or who to call to help us with it. Time provides experience that helps us to do that. And every time the grieving person learns a new task, dealing with the unknown task becomes one less task on the list. That's just kind of what life does to us. Mark said, with time, your thoughts will turn to helping others. You'll realize you have been shown how to do that and how not to do that. People want to be helpful, but some haven't learned how because they've not been there. You know, one of the neat things that God allows us to do is take our negatives and turn them into positives by taking our difficult situations and helping others who are going through that. And many of you will be able to do that. For those having suffered for a long period of demise, time allows for the return of remembering the person as their normal self. This slide is very personal to me because when my mom died, she was weak and frail and cancer broken and ridden. And I remember when she died thinking, I will never be able to remember my mom as she was. I don't want to remember her like she was when she died. But you know what? I can't really even imagine my mom today in her broken, weakened, lessened person. I can't. Trying as hard as I can, I kind of remember. I remember the hospital bed beside my dad's bed. I remember having to help take care of her because she couldn't go to the bathroom because she didn't have the strength to get up and do it. That's a very difficult thing for a mom who is proper and prim in every way. But for the life of me, when I mention my mom to you, I remember the same. The same woman, I'm tired, that you all remember. Because what happens in the grieving process is with time, we return to who the person really was instead of being consumed with the fact that we don't have them anymore. And that's a pretty thing. Today, if Lisa were with you, she would go, oh, I miss Carrie. I miss him so badly. But then she would spend most of her time talking about what they had, who he was, who he is, how God blessed her with him. She feels today like I could live my life being married for 100 years to somebody else and I wouldn't have what I had with him for the 50 years or 45 years that we were married. That's her predominant thought now. Instead of, I don't have him anymore. That's something for you all to look forward to. That day will come. So triggers, we're winding down. Triggers are experiences that remind us of the past. They can be positive and they can be negative, helpful or hurtful. Triggers are often unexpected and unanticipated. The ones that blindside us or catch us off guard are the ones that affect us the most. And every time we experience a trigger, it loses some of its intensity. And the more time that passes, the fewer new triggers exist. I don't know that you'll ever get them all eliminated. I don't know that that will happen. But the more time passes, the fewer new ones exist. So, what does Bill McDonald say about how do you know if you've done it successfully, if you've grieved well? He says those who find someone that they can talk to and share with and be real with are the ones who do well. Find someone or ones who can be your anchor or your rocks. Number two, he says, those who do it well make decisions to put one step in front of the other and press through their grief. Number three, they successfully forgive and amend relationships. You have to do that. You know, I'm reluctant to say the word stupid, especially in the place where my mom most taught me you don't use that word. However, she can't stop me, can she? People say some of the most stupid things to people who are grieving. They just do. And at first, it makes us angry, and we think they ought to understand. The more they do it, the more we come around to the place where we realize they don't understand because they've not been there. And I'm thankful they've not been there. And you kind of discount it because they're ignorant. It's part of what Bill's talking about here. You let things go, and you have to amend relationships. I can't tell you how often I have to help people who are grieving deal with family matters that became argumentative, they became hurtful. Why? Because there's so much stress on everybody that it's easy to say things, and it's easy to feel things and do things. And the longer it goes, the more we realize that and let it go and love each other. Part of success in the grieving process. Those who grieve successfully learn that the best way to receive is to give. It is more blessed to give than to receive. They learn to take one day at a time. Will I ever be able to live again? You can look at it that way, or you can look at it, can I make it through this day? And you make it through the day. They use their transformation to help others beginning in the process. Oh, how true it is. We sleep so much better at night when we spend the day doing for others as opposed to spending the day looking for ways that others can do for us. And I've added to Bill's list by saying those who grieve successfully lean on God in a greater way than ever before. Well, if I could sum up this session, I would do so by saying just continue to put one step in front of the other. Continue to press through one day at a time. Be willing to endure some discomfort in an effort to not get stuck. Try to be patient and lean on God by having an ongoing and daily relationship with Him. Now, I want to add one other thing to this and say this. It's okay for some days for you to get in bed and stay there. Now, I don't want you to do it continually, but sometimes you just need a break. And if that's what you need to catch your breath, to re-energize, to get through one of those down times, it's okay. It's okay. So, questions or comments? I'll stay as long, or we can stop as quickly as you all want to.
Notice the sun came out out there, Barry. Stuff the weather. We've had cloudy days here for a long time. And the sun will come out tomorrow.
Yeah.
I think the weather sometimes has an effect on the way I feel, I know.
Seasonal depression is a very real thing. This time of the year when the days are short and the dark is quick and the temperature is cold matters. You're exactly right.
Does anybody look for signs of their loved ones who have passed? Like, I know me and Mary were talking before, like, some people look at a cardinal, they say, well, that's, this soul of one that's passed. Does anybody experience anything like that? Or, think, well, just like we opened the Bible, the songbook, and it was, I'll Fly Away, the song that Garrett sang in church every Sunday. I'm like, what's the odds of it being marked right where I sat? I look for little signs like that every day that, I think of it as a sign. Maybe it's just my way of coping and healing, but I feel like that's His Spirit still with me. It's kind of like God. We don't feel Him and we don't see Him. We talk to Him when He doesn't talk back to us, but I know He's there, and that's how I feel with my Garrett. I can't do any of those things, but it's like I feel his spirit with me. I know he's there. And sometimes I see signs that I'm like, that came from Garrett. I just know it did. And that gives me comfort.
Yeah, that's a difficult conversation to have because we don't know what to do with that.
I got one like that. So, like you say, maybe coincidence, maybe whatever, but whenever that happened over there, we live close to that. And my wife said that as soon as it happened, now mind you, let me back up. Nobody relayed what I'm fixing to tell you. I ain't even told them this right now. As soon as it happened, my wife said that farther along came into her head, the song. And whenever we were trying to come up with arrangements, Angie said, I need to think of, so I need some time to think about what songs to do there, specifically the church song, I think. And so we didn't say anything at all. And that night I called one of Dad's friends that he worked with over there, and I said, we can't figure out, because Dad didn't sing. He was a devoted Christian, but he hadn't crossed that. He didn't do that yet. And I said, did you ever hear Dad sing or mutter or mention any song? He said, only one. I said, what was it? And he said, Farther Along. And that night I called Angie. I said, what song did y'all come up with? And she said, Farther Along. Is that a coincidence? Maybe. Maybe. But it sure made us think that was the right song.
Right.
Made us think about Dad.
I can get myself in trouble pretty quick,
Can't you?
but I believe that once we step over to the other side, we are no longer bound by time or by space. Now, that can get really deep really quick. It's really hard for me to imagine that once we breathe our last breath and step over to the other side, that God locks us up in a room and makes us wait for everybody else to get there. Now, I know and I understand the passages, John 5:28-29, all in the grave shall come forth, they that done good to the resurrection of life and evil to the resurrection of damnation. And, I used to tell my Freed Hardman kids, I hope when the trumpet sounds, I'm the first one out of the grave, because the dead in Christ shall rise first. I want to be the first one out. I know all those passages. I also know that in the book of Revelation, John described heaven as a place with a street of gold and gates of pearl, and basically what he said is, if I told you really what I saw, you wouldn't believe it. You couldn't. You don't have the ability. And I think that, in a way, is similar to this, in God saying, your understanding is very finite, and understanding a place where there are no boundaries of time or space or beyond your comprehension, don't spend too much time trying. But I've always kind of been a rebel. And if indeed when we step over to the other side, we are more like God instead of less, then it would make sense to me that we have a greater sense of awareness, not less. Now, I better quit talking fast before I dig a hole for myself that I can't get out of. But
You need to bring that up.
I believe that the spiritual world doesn't cease to exist, or that there's not a place of unawareness and sleep at the point of death. Now, I don't know what all that means. I don't know what the extent of that is. I sit in the counseling room all day, every day. Not all day, every day. Every day I sit in the counseling room dealing with people who are struggling with grief. And I hear so many situations that may be random, may be not. My personal belief is some of them are, some of them aren't. I just can't tell you which ones are and which ones aren't. But from someone who has statistical research background, statistically, it's pretty improbable that all those are random. Now, what's the extent of it? I don't know. But it's pretty comforting to me to think of my mom and to believe that she's not bound by time or by space for a lot of different reasons.
I think there's a difference in the spirit and the body too.
Absolutely. What else? Let's change the topic quick.
My mother punched me very, she said, ask him what he thinks about, she's been talking to some people that's involved in an accident out here that's got young children, like 11 years and under. How do you help people like young people at that age, at a young spot in their life, trying to explain to them?
Well, here's where I'll start with that. In fact, I think this will sum up my answer. When children are raised in environments where they have adversity, if they have an appropriate support group or person, they usually wind up doing better than those who did not have that adversity. And you'll think, how does that answer that question? I'll get there. I'll give you a personal example. My Haley's husband, Will, grew up with a single mom. Right after he was born, his dad left the family for another woman. And he's basically not been there at all for Will. Now that's sad, it's terrible. However, she couldn't have found a man that loves her more or is a better father more than he is, because he wants to make sure and provide for my granddaughters and my daughter what he didn't have. Now, if you were to ask me, am I glad Will grew up that way? My answer would be no, not at all. I hate that. I feel sorry for him that he did that. But if you also ask me, did he have to grow up sooner? Did he have to become stronger? Is he a better wife and husband today because he went through? My answer to that is absolutely. My worry today is way more for kids who don't have adversity growing up than those who do. And I see a lot of that. I see a lot of 22-year-old kids who get out of college who are so protected from adversity and things that are difficult that they didn't have the opportunity to understand what real life is like, and therefore when they get to be 22, they're not ready for it. So how does that answer the question? My answer to the question is that we be a part of that support system and help them through their difficulty, because in the end, if their support system, spiritually, faith development wise, and in other ways is there, they're probably going to grow up faster than the other kids. They're probably going to see things as the light of the sun from Isaiah, as we talked about earlier. I really feel more sorry for the ones that don't have anything than the ones that do. But our part is to make sure that we are there for them so that they constantly have that encouragement and that support. You know, why were our grandparents so tough? You know, all of them lost a child or two. You know, they all had to deal with death earlier than we do. You know, they were stoic sometimes. Sometimes they hid it in unhealthy ways, but, you know, they were loyal and committed, and, you know, adversity didn't take that away from them. What else? I'm preaching, aren't I? Questions? Comments?
Could you give us a preview of the lessons for tomorrow? Really looking forward to it.
So tomorrow morning in class, we're going to talk about dealing with adversity. Where does adversity come from? When something bad happens, is it fair to say that God caused it? If God didn't cause it, but if he could have stopped it and didn't, is there any difference? What do we do with it when it comes our way? To what degree do we believe Satan causes it, or God caused it, or we caused it ourselves through decisions we made or decisions that others made? And then what do we do with it when it comes? That's 9 o'clock. At 10 o'clock tomorrow, we're going to talk about do's and don'ts of helping people who are grieving. How church members can do a better job of being helpful to those who are going through the grieving process. Anything else? Well, I'll be here. If I can help any of you all, I'm glad to do that. If you can get my phone number from Calvin or John, or if you'll come to me before you leave, I'll give you my cell phone number. I'll be glad to put you on the schedule and help in any way I can. It won't cost you anything. We're here to help, not to charge. So I'll hang around if you want to talk. I'll be glad to do that. Brother Jim Suddeth, there's nothing I'd rather hear than you pray right now. So will you lead us in prayer as we close?
Almighty God, our Heavenly Father. Father, we're thankful to call you our Father. Know that you care for us.